This is Gemara Horayos Daf Zayin, and we're holding on Vavam and Beis. We began the second parak, but we're going to begin it once again. The second parak dealing with the Kohen Mashiach. All the learning for this month, the month of Elul, has been generously sponsored by a close friend of the Daf as an incredible Schos Aliyas Neshama for Aster Reyzel Basra Meir B'Siyata Dishmaya. The incredible Koyach HaTorah should bring the neshama of Aster Reyzel Basra Meir to an incredibly high place in Gan Eden Shel Maila. So we begin once again, says the Mishnah. Hayra Kohen Mashiach La'atzmai. If the Kohen Mashiach, literally the Kohen Gadol that was Meshuach, that was anointed with the anointing oil, if he paskin La'atzmai for himself, shoygig, by mistake, v'asa shoygig, and then he did the same thing by mistake, an avera. Maybe par, he brings a par. Shoygig, if he paskin by mistake, v'asa mezid, and then he acted on his psak intentionally, then, mezid v'asa shoygig, he paskin intentionally, did it unintentionally, but why? Shahira kayim b'shich la'atzmai, ke hayra bezdin litzibur. This psak of the Kohen Mashiach that he's paskening for himself is at the same level of the bezdin paskening litzibur, which was the first parak. So before we go into the Gemara, let's look at the top. It's not the Rashi, the Mefarish over here. Hayra Kohen Mashiach. Hayra shaygeg v'asa mezid. Oisha hayra mezid v'asa shaygeg. Pater mi carbon. Why? Shayiraz Kohen Mashiach la'atzmei karaz bezdin litzibur. And the Mefarish here now fills in the blanks. Ma hayraz bezdin litzibur. Ein chayavim ella al helam davar. Just like we learned in the first parak, that when bezdin paskins litzibur, there's an obligation, unless there's a helam davar, there was a mistake, im shigas ma'isa, with an action that was a shaygeg. Avayras kayim mishiach la'atzmai in a chayiv ella al helam davar im shigas ma'isa. As the Gemara is going to explain, we'll learn from a pasuk. So, with that introduction, let's dive straight into the Gemara. Says the Gemara, what was the first case? Shagavaza shaygeg mevi par. Says the Gemara Pshita, this is Pashit. Amar Abaye, Yacham Amaya Skinan, Kiyon Shahira, he paskin v'shachach. And then he forgot what he paskind. Me'ezetam, he forgot Me'ezetam Hayra, he forgot what was the reason that he paskin such. Ubisha Sheta Amar, and at the moment he made a mistake, he said, Arini Oisel Das, I'm performing this action on the condition of Arasai. I don't remember why I paskin such, but I paskin such, and I'm acting now on that psak. Demahu detim, I would have thought, Kivan ilum misyadalei, that if at that moment he would have remembered, if at that moment misyadalei, he would have known the reason why he paskin such, shemar haderbei, maybe he would have been chayzer, maybe he would have backed out, and he would have said, oh, this was wrong. Therefore, acting now on that original psak without knowing why, maybe kemezidami, maybe it should have a status of a mezid, and therefore, in the bottom line, v'loy lechayiv, and it's not chayiv, kamash malan. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that even in this case, he is chayiv. Next case. So now ask the Gemara, Minani Mili, where do we know? Minani Mili, from where do we know this halacha on the Mishnah? Says the Gemara, the Tanu Rabbanon. We learned in a brayso la ashmas hom. The brayso said that if the kohen doesn't have ira to the asham, to the guilt of the people, Hare Mashiach Kitzibor, this shows us that the anointed Kohen, the Mashiach, is like the tzibor, as that pasuk of la'ashmas ha'am, the tzibor, the beginning of that pasuk is kohen Mashiach. So therefore, we know that they have the same dinim. Now the Gemara says, why do we need a pasuk? Sheyachal, I would have thought, v'aloi dinu, should it not be a kal v'chaymer, as we turn over to Zayin Amar Aleph, tzibor, should be a kal v'chaymer, tzibor mutza mechlal yachid, yachlo Mashiach, mutza mechlal yachid. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. We should have a very basic kal v'chaymer. If a tzibor is mechlal mechlal yachid, that what? As the Tama first spells out, yachid maybe kiss voice ira, yet a tzibor does not bring such, brings a par. O Mashiach mutza mechlal yachid, and the kohen Mashiach is as well not taken out of the category of a yachid. Ma tzibor, just like when it came to the tzibor, we have a precedent that ein chayavim ela al helem davar im shigas meisa, in the precedent of the tzibor, in which we have a case that the carbon is not the regular carbon. And when is it brought? Only if there's helem davar im shigas meisa. So too, why don't we say af Mashiach? We should say a kal v'chaymer le'chayiv should not be obligated ella, unless it's what alelem davar im shigas ma'isa. That's one way of learning, says the Gemara. Or maybe oiklach l'derech zu, or maybe I'll tell you the opposite. Nasi mitzvah mechlal yachid, and Nasi doesn't have a din of a yachid, and Mashiach mitzvah mechlal yachid. So maybe the Mashiach should be equated to the Nasi. That what? Man Nasi, maybe Mishigas Maisa, Biloi Helem Davar, not like the tzibor. You don't need to have an Helem Davar. Obviously, maybe Mishigas Maisa, Biloi Helem Davar. So we have two different ways trying to figure out who should we equate the Kohen Mashiach to. Who? So says the Braisa, Nira Lemi Daime. To what is it more comparable? 10 lines down, the first one line is Lemi. Tzibor Bibar. I'll tell you, it makes more sense to say that the tzibor gets a kapara bipar, ve'ein meviyam asham toli, u'mashiach bipar, ve'ein meviyam asham toli. So I have another reason to connect and equate to the kohen Mashiach with the carbon of the tzibor, and not like the nasi, and therefore, but continues the Braisa, but maybe not. Or maybe not. Nasi, maybe a Nasi brings the carbon, and do maybe Asham Vadai, the Nasi brings a Seir when it comes to an Aveira involving Avodah Zarah. And the Nasi brings an Asham Vadai, Mashiach, but the Mashiach may be Seir B'Vizchavim, or maybe Asham Vadai. So now we have another reason why the Kohen Mashiach is more comparable to the Nasi. So we're having this flux, trying to figure out what do we equate the Kohen Mashiach to. It's not part of the tzibor. Therefore, maybe it has a din of it's not the same as a yachid. It's moitzi mechlal yachid like the tzibor. So maybe it has a din like a tzibor. Or on the other hand, it has qualities that it's similar to the nasi. It's also moitzi mechlal yachid. So now we're going to the second step, trying to find another comparison. And again, in step number 2, we found similarities to the tzibor and similarities to the nasi. Says the Gemara, so maybe Manasi, maybe Shikas Maisa, maybe Shikas Maisa. So we have a dual back and forth, trying to figure out, is the Kohen Mashiach like the Nasi or like the Tzibor? And therefore, says the Gemara, Talmud Leimar, we have a pasuk that says Lashmasam Harehu Mashiach Kitzibor, and from this pasuk, the pasuk that begins, and let's just pull up the pasuk for everyone's viewing pleasure for a quick moment. It's on the side of your Gemaras. What does the pasuk say? and Makayin HaMashiach Yechete Le'ashmas Ha'am. So we see that when the pasuk is referencing the Aveira of the Kayin Mashiach, it's putting it together with what? With La'ashmas Ha'am. It's equating it to the people. So says the Gemara, so Talmud Laimar. So what do we see? That it's like the Tzibur. And that what? Ma Tzibur, just like the Tzibur. Einoi Mevi Elo Al Helem Davar Im Shigyas Maisa. Just like the Tzibur only brings it if there is a element of Helem, the element of something unknown, together with a Shoygeg. Av Mashiach Eina Mevi El Helem Davar Im Shigyas Maisa. So that's why the Gemara began at the bottom, asking the Makar. We brought the pasuk. We said, why do you need a Makar? Why don't we learn out from a Kal V'chaimer? The Gemara went back and forth, and the Gemara cannot conclusively prove that the Kayin Mashiach is similar to the Tzibur. Therefore, we're back to the pasuk. But ask the Gemara 1 second, Ema, perhaps Ma Tzibur Hayra Va'asu Acharav Bahira Asoy Chayavim. Why don't we say that just like with regarding the Tzibur, the halacha is that if Bezdin says something is mutter and the people follow the Bezdin, what's the halacha Chayavim? There's the Chiyav Paralam Davar Shel Tzibur. So why don't we say the same thing? Meaning, if the Kayin Mashiach has a din of a tzibur, klapping his carbon, ask the Gemara, he should have a din of a tzibur, that what? That if the people listen to him, should have the same carbon. Talmud Loimar says the pasuk, v'hekriv al chatasoi asher chata. Says the pasuk, he brings a carbon for the avera that he did. Al ma shechato mevi, but ve'inal mevi al ma shechatu achir. That the carbon is only going to be brought for his own avera, not for an avera of others. So in as much as the Kayin Mashiach has a din of a tzibur, it doesn't go as it doesn't go all the way to obligate that if the tzibur did it, would have the same requirements. Says the Gemara, Amar Mar, now that we have the Makar for this din, let's go a drop deeper into that which we just quoted in the Brayso, Mashiach Leparvi and maybe Asham Taloi Minolan. Where do we know this from? Dein maybe Asham Taloi, Techsev, Chibar Alav Akayin al Shegasai Sher Shagag, Mishachatasai Shegasai Shava. They're equal. Yatsa Mashiach Shen Shegasai Chatasai Shava. Why not? Techsev, La Ashmasar Hareu Mashiach Yitzibor La Ashmasam. Adkan loy kamer le ela asham kedei nazva. So says the Gemara. Excuse me, that was a kasha. Harei Mashiach Yitzibor. Period. Ask the Gemara lashvasam. Adkan lo kamer le. But the pasuk didn't yet bring down the pasuk of lashvasam, and therefore, how can we know the equation? Elish asham kedei nazva. Says the Gemara, you're right. It's just kedei nazva. We don't really have a makar to this secondary din. We continue with another Mishnah continuing the halachas of the Kayin Mashiach. Hayra b'fnei atzmai v'asa b'fnei atzmai. The Kayin Mashiach paskins on his own, and then he acts, and he does based on his psak on his own. The halacha is, he brings his own carbon chatas. Hayra im atzibur. But what happened if he paskind together with the tzibur, with Bezdin, v'asa im atzibur, then mischab lo im atzibur, then he has a kabara together with the tzibur, then he has a kabara together with the paralam davar that the tzibur has to bring. Shein Bezdin chayavin at shi'er levatel mixas ulekayim mixas v'chein Mashiach, and the same halacha applies by this Kayin Mashiach. V'loi ba'avodas kachavim, says the Mishnah, Bezdin is not chayiv in a case of avodah zara ad sheyor levatel Mixas Ulikaya mixas. The same halach of the Paral Davar Shel Tzibor that applies to Bezdin that we saw in parak number 1. That applies to the Karim Meshuach as we saw in parak number 2. As we're extending now to say that it has the same particular as Yeri Levatel mixas Ulikaya mixas, says the Gemara, the same applies to Avodah Zara. Ask the Gemara, case number 2 in the Mishnah was that if the Kayin Meshuach had a psak together with the Bezdin, then he gets a kapara together with the tzibor, with the paral davar shel tzibor. Ask the Gemara, Hani Mili, from where do we know this from? Teitanu Rabbanan Hayrayim Atzibor Vasim Atzibor. Yochel, I would think Yavi Parlatz. Maybe, even though he paskin with the tzibor, he has to bring a par for himself. It didn't, and the truth is, it's logical. Nasi Maitzi Mechal Yachid, O Mashiach Maitzi Mechal Yachid. Both the Nasi and the Kayin Meshuach, both are excluded or taken out of the status of a Yach. And therefore, what? Ma Nasi Chata Bivnei Atzma Bivnei Atzmai. And what's the din of a Nasi? If he's Chata im Atzibor, he's what? Mischaber lo im Atzibor. Mashiach Chata Bivnei Atzma Bivnei Atzma Chata Atzibor Mischata lo im Atzibor. He gets a kapara together with the tzibur. So says the Gemara, what's the hava amina? You're telling me that it's like the tzibur's pashit. It's a kal v'chaymer. Says the Gemara, lo yim amr ben nasi. By a nasi, I understand why. Shechein mischaper lo yim atzibur b'yom kippurim. Because now we have another precedent that on Yom Kippur the nasi gets kapara together with the tzibur. But Tamer ben Mashiach shein mischaper lo yim atzibur. The Kain Mashiach does not get kapara with the tzibur in Yom Kippur b'yom kippurim. Ha'il ve'im mischaper lo yim atzibur b'yom kippurim. So says the Gemara. So now I'll tell you, since he doesn't get a kapara with tzibur in Yom Kippur, Yachol, I would think Yavi Parlas made his own carbon. Therefore, the pasuk teaches me what? Chata bifnei atzmai chata sai. Then maybe bifnei atzmai. But if he's chata ma'atzibur b'schat le'im ma'atzibur, look at the kapara together with the tzibur, and that is our makar for the din of the Mishnah. That if the nasi paskins and acts correctly together with the tzibur upsak with Bezdin, he does not need his own kapara, but rather he gets a kapara with the paral davar shel tzibur. Says the Gemara, Echidami, what is the halacha? Echidami, what's the case? If the case is where the Kain Mashiach is mamish the greatest Talmid Chacham, v'him in a muflaim, and the Bezdin is not pshita dem is chaper lebifnei atzmos, and it's pashit, then in case he does have hair on his own, he gets kapar on his own. Hayra delahayim delay klum, because their psak is nothing. And everyone has to bring their own carbon, like he himself. V'deinon muflaim, but if he's not a mufla, if he's not the Talmid Chacham, not the Gadol Adar, v'halav mufla, and they as well are not, so why does he get his own kapara? So Gemara is trying to figure out the din in the Mishnah. That the Mishnah, the first din in the Mishnah taught us, Mamish, the first din in the parak from yesterday. We started at the beginning of today's year. We said maybe par. The Gemara is trying to figure out what is this case that we're going to have that the Kain Meshuach is going to be bringing a par on his own. So Amar Rapapa, as we turn over to Zayin and Beis, explains Rapapa, you know what the case is? Kegayin Shayam Muflin Shnei, and both he, the Kain Meshuach, and the Bezdin are both Muflan, they're both Talmidei Chacham, they're both outstanding. Gadolei Hadar, that's going to be the case in which the Mishnah will apply. As the Tam Mefarsh speaks out, that's the Chiddush is going to be that even though he passes together with the Bezdin, he's going to have to bring a carbon on his own. Says the Gemara, Savra Abayil Meimer, what is this case? What is this case in which he passes on his own, and then he has to bring the carbon on his own? So Abayah thought, you know what the case is? Chata b'fnei atzmai, va'asa b'fnei atzmai hechidami. What's this case? Says Abaroi, Diyasu b'shnei mekaymais, v'kamayri b'trei yisuri. Bezdin and the Kohen Meshuach are in two different places, and they rule about two different dinim. Amalei Rava, Atu Shtei Makayim, garment is because they're in two different places. I don't care, says Rava. They could be in the same place. But they keep the Kamayr betray Isuri. They're asking about two different Isurim. Therefore, the Isser that the Kohen Meshuach paskin and follow through is his own Isser. Chata b'fnei atzmayu has the din of a chait b'fnei atzmai. Says the Gemara. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper. So the following is Pasha. Pshita. We're 6 lines down, the 2 dots, Zayin base. Who b'chalavim b'avedil chavim, if he passes about chaylav, they pass about zara, chat b'fnei atzmahu. The chalukim b'taymayo, the different averas, the chalukim b'karbanois. Tave b'par, v'hein b'par, v'sir, and they have different karbanois. He has to bring a par, they bring a par and a sire. The kamaisi ani sir, v'ula maisi. They have to bring a seer for his mistaken psak about a zara, and he only has to bring a par of a kolshkin who, and certainly in the flip side that what? If he paskins incorrectly about his chavim mechelev, the chalukim b'karbonai sayem legamri, that what? To see ira v'ino par. So those cases are pashit that it would be his own unique psak, in which they would have differing karbanos, differing everythings. But what's the kasha? If there's two different types of chaylev, he, the Kohen Meshuach, paskins about one, they, the Bezin, pask about another. Mahu, what's the halacha? Me, I'm reading Avagav the Karbanos Shav, the same Karbanos. But Kivan Dimitri Kasi, we learn out from two different psukim. They're called different averos, and therefore the Kohen Meshuach would have to bring his own karban and not be part of the Parlam Davar Shel Tzibor. Oidilma, Shem Chelev Echadu. It's all one Aveira. Tim Slim, if you're going to tell me Shei Chelevu, it's all one Aveira. Says the Gemara, Hu B'Chelev Ein B'Dam, Mahu. If he paskins incorrectly about Chelev, they paskin incorrectly about Dam. Mahu. Me, I'm reading a bit Tamayu obligin. L'maisa, they're different timing in Gansin. No, it's true. One's chaylev, one's dam, but even the shav and carbon, they have the same carbon. Basar carbon aslina. So we're trying to figure out what is going to be this case that there could be two mistaken psakim, one by him and one by Bezdin, but he's viewed independently, and he therefore has to bring his own carbon. Says the Gemara, Teiku, we're gonna have to wait for Yoa Navi for this one, and we're 10 lines before the Mishnah. We continue quoting the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, She'ein Bezdin, Chayav and Acher Levatel mixes Lekayim mixas. Says the Gemara, Minalon. How do we know that Acher Levatel mixes Lekayim mixes? Kedam Rinon Be'idach Pirkin. How do we know that the same halacha that applied by, Minalon that Acher Levatel mixes Lekayim mixes? How do we know that that halacha applies by us? Answers the Gemara, Kedam Rinon. Like we learned, Bidach Perkin in the first parak that said what? V'nelam davar davar v'loy kol hagof. It says v'nelam davar. There we darshan davar, part of a matter. V'loy kol hagof, but not the entire matter entirely. V'chein HaMashiach continues the Mishnah, and similarly the din about the Kohen Meshuach is the same din of being levatel, part of the mitzvah, the partial avera. Minalan. The pasuk says, if the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Meshuach doesn't have a lashmasam, the pasuk we started off the first half of today's shir with, Harei Mashiach Kitzibor, as we've learned. Says the Gemara, so we have the same halachos minalan, the Tan Rabbanon, Fishiyat Avodas Chavim Ladun Latzmai. Avodas Zara has its own halachos. It's judged on its own. And the fact that what? The tzibur would have to bring a par and a sayir for this avera. So maybe it has its own rules entirely. And maybe the only time you're going to be chayiv is if you totally uproot the entirety, the entire entity of the zara. It says me'enei by the Parlam Davar Shel Tzibor. It says me'enei over here. Malahalan bebezdin avkanami bebezdin. Malahalan davar v'lo kol hagof Afkanami davar v'kol agof, and that's what teaches us the halachas of kohen mashuach, halachas of the zara, are the same that we learned in the first parak of the Averos B'tzibur of Levatel makes us, Lekayin makes us. Let's just begin the next Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Ein chayav in alelim davar im shigas ma'isa. The bezdin is not chayiv for a chatas, for a helam davar and a shigas ma'isa. V'chein ha-mashiach, v'loi bavarus chavim in chayavim el elam davar im shigas ma'isa. As we just learned moments ago, the only chiyav is when you have these unique details of what? Helem davar im shigyas maisa. Says the Gemara, and with this will conclude Minalan, the Tanarabanan, Yishku, says the Pasik. There's an Avera, the clans Klal Yisrael, Yachach, and Shigyas maisa, Tamlamer Yishku, and Helem davar, and Chayavim el Helem davar, in Shigas Maisa, and the same by Mashiach, Mashiach Manalan Tachsev, Lash Masaham, Ari Mashiach Ketzibor. Stop over here, I'll pick it up from here, B'siyata Dishmai.